Great to see everyone here for another GRIP-Birkman Coaches Cafe, as we are talking about the changes that could happen to your personality with sustained stress, even trauma, that COVID-19, the pandemic, might have caused for many people. And the real question, should I retest? Should I take the questionnaire again to see how my personality might have changed? As we look at it from a number of different perspectives and how your perspective might have changed. Might it have changed temporarily? Might it have changed permanently? And as you're also talking to your clients, what are they experiencing? Are they requesting a retest? And if so, how should you respond to them? How can you help them to determine if a retest really is warranted right now, or if they are perhaps in a temporary state that would mean that they should not retest right now, but helping them to learn how to deal with that appropriately. All of that's going to come out in our conversation this morning. With us, I want to particularly point out, we have Mark McGowan, who is the training manager at Birkman International. Mark, having had a number of years with Crew and having been a part of the GRIP-Birkman community, and now the training manager at Birkman. So Mark, we will be looking to you for your expert input on this and the official stance from Birkman, but also several of us that have been Birkman certified professionals for some time, like John Blake, Ken DeMar, Les Cool, Susan Gay, all of whom have been certified professionals for quite some time and at even advanced levels. So the panel is well-versed. John Blake, because I'm going to pick on you, and I didn't warn you about this ahead of time, but because of your position with a large healthcare organization in the Northwest, and having seen a lot of people who are living in stress and even perhaps some real signs of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, among a lot of those health professionals, particularly as they were in just a long, sustained period of stress with the pandemic. Just a couple of just off-the-cuff observations that you might have about how this might have been affecting them in the way they were interacting with each other and how their Birkman scores might be informative on that.
Well, I mean, I think the simple answer to that is that people are operating out of stress behavior, right? And, back to the early days, I remember being in a couple of meetings, probably month, 2 months in, and coming out and talking with one of my teammates and saying, I've never heard so much yelling at Providence in my previous 5 years as there was in that short amount of time. And that was just heated emotions. And as time went on, then you saw a lot more of the self-protective nature, of that, of very self-centered, which is ultimately what stress behavior is, right? It's us protecting ourselves and meeting our needs in the way that we all think that we have to. And so because of that, just seeing a lot of that, seeing that from leadership in the hospital, seen that from obviously frontline as well, and there's the it's also sort of that there's these stressful crisis episodes that happen that are a little bit different than ongoing stress behavior. But now as people are re-looking at their assessments, because frankly for a lot of people that there wasn't that chance, that people are re-evaluating their assessment. They're saying, oh yeah, that is true. I've just been seeing more of that stress behavior or it's been a lot closer to the surface than I would like for it to be. So
yeah, we really zero in on that stress behavior part of it, don't we? Where I have actually had someone before who was looking at their stress behavior in their Birkman report and saying, no, that's just not me. That's not me. That's not me. And where we look and we say, well, maybe the reason it's not you is because you're just not really experiencing a lot of stress. You're, in an environment where most of your needs and expectations are being met. But then how surprising it can be when something starts to go wrong in their world and the stress behavior comes out, and I have heard this statement, maybe some of you have too. Oh, that's just not me. That's just not me. And, you know, the response I come back with, and I say, yes, that absolutely is you. It's just you under stress. And if that is just as natural for you as your usual effective style of behavior, it's just that you haven't been used to seeing this part of yourself coming out because of the unmet needs or expectations. Ken, in a ministry environment where you have seen ministry leaders dealing with this as well and dealing with their people, and like when churches were shut down, and in Canada for perhaps a longer period of time by mandate than in some parts, at least, of the US or other places, but in some cases where churches elected to stay closed for a longer period of time than perhaps even the mandate would say. What kind of responses are you seeing from people there? And not just what was going on during the pandemic, but what's the lasting response that you're seeing from that?
It's interesting, thinking about this whole process of living in stress, living in our stress behavior. What we saw, several cases. I mean, first of all, of course, there's an unprecedented number of pastors who are just leaving ministry. And just in many ways, their stress behavior became so evident that it didn't fit the context of their ministry. And so consequently, there's this tension there. The other thing that happened is that in more than one case, staff relations changed because they're living in their stress behavior. So it's almost like they're saying to each other, I don't know you. This is not the you I know. And consequently, there's repercussions of that, of course. And I think the other interesting thing is I was working with a church team just recently, and they were actually formed about the time the pandemic started. So the only way they know each other now over the last 3.5 years is in stress behavior. So now, as that is lessening, they're suddenly saying, "Who are you? You're not the person I've worked with for the last 3 years," and that's causing stress, and that's causing relational team stress. So I just think, this whole idea of something that puts us in a position of being under stress, and then the response to that, it's having an incredible impact on us. And sadly, while we're talking about it today, I would say most of the people you and I talk to really don't understand what's happened, and can't put words to what it is they're experiencing.
Les, in your denomination, are you seeing some similar things?
Yeah, everything Ken's saying. I'll just pick up on one piece he said about teams that were formed during COVID. My team at my church was formed. I moved during COVID from one church to the other. And so I know my team under stress, and I'm learning my team in normal, whatever normal is. And they're two different teams. So Ken, yeah, I hear what you said there. The other piece of what I'm seeing is people who are less stable normally, who are reactionary to stuff around them, became even more so during COVID. So some of my pastor friends, they went off the reservation, as it were. Some of them have quit. Some of them are still unemployed because they don't know what they want to be when they grow up. And they're trying to figure out who they are in their new normal. And then people who are normally very staid, self-controlled, very particular, they seem to do well during COVID because the stress didn't touch them. And I'm one of those people. I went through stress just like I do normal daily life. I came out of COVID just like I was before. And I was chatting with my wife about that. She said, well, when we first got married, I thought you were a telephone pole because you didn't react to anything. And when I hugged you, I looked for splinters. And so I did a little fun thing, I don't know, a couple months ago. I went back in my cabinet and dug out my high school yearbook and read what my classmates said about me. And apparently, if I had taken a GRIP-Birkman back then, my Birkman probably would have looked like my current Birkman does, because I'm that person. And so, you know, I observed that from the other side of it, from having become part of a team during COVID and now watching them relax back into their norm.
So the whole thing of stress, Mark, I'm going to ask you to be responding to a bunch of this in just a little bit. But before we do that, I want to get Susan to kick in on the whole thing of people who have been under stress, particularly like the people that John was mentioning, but to some extent also those that Ken and Les were mentioning, where there were teams that were under living under stress, operating under stress for a long period of time. And we usually think of post-traumatic stress disorder as being something that comes from some traumatic event that happens, but isn't it true that PTSD can also be evident in people who are in sustained periods of stress or ongoing trauma?
Yes, definitely. We see that, you know, in a number of cases. You see it in children who grew up in abusive homes, or you know, in a difficult situation, in a neglected or deprived situation. And that long-term stress over time accumulates and affects the person's personality. In childhood, it affects their ability to make healthy attachments in relationships as well. And the you know, the other thing is that as adults, we can have long-term results of stress. We see that a lot in disasters, particularly those long-term disasters like earthquakes, things like that, where maybe a person's home is destroyed and their surroundings are destroyed. Maybe they lose their job as a result of the disaster. And so they're under a prolonged period of stress, which turns into trauma and not just stress. In the healthcare industry, I think, you know, they were subjected to a lot more serious illness or death than they're used to over a long period of time. And there was a lot of burnout because of that in the healthcare industry. And also, I think part of that burnout maybe was also related to the fact that the healthcare industry they were used to working in changed so rapidly. And maybe not always in a good way. Maybe the management didn't really know how to manage those types of conditions, especially at first. They learned as time went on and got better at it. But there was a sense that long-term stress for a lot of people turned into trauma. One thing you and I talked about, Larry, was the type of personality that a person has also might have been affected, because people who are extroverts who were subjected to long-term isolation did not fare well. But people who are introverts who perhaps prefer to be alone or with just a small core group of other people, that selectively sociable that Birkman talks about, did better, because that's their need, that's their expectation of how the world ought to operate. And so even though it was more extreme than usual for them, it was not as big of a blow as for some of the other people who had to suppress all of their socialization for a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those. You may have noticed I changed my symbols, because in the beginning I had my interests and my usual and my need stress showing, but when you look at my usual and my need stress, I'm a green, blue, blue. So my needs were very much being met during the whole pandemic because I'm way down in the bottom corner of the blue with my needs and stress on the map. In fact, Dr. Birkman said that if I could get outside the box, I would. And I'm very much an outside of the box type person. I was just thrilled when he said that, you know, but recognizing how much I needed and still need that alone time, that so selectively sociable time with people that I want to be around. And so, yeah, I was one of those people that my battery just got absolutely charged during COVID. However, what I did not recognize was how now post-pandemic, I'm still experiencing some of the fatigue and other things that go along with it, partially, I'm sure, because I was not physically as active as I should have been. And also, I did get COVID. In spite of the fact that I had been vaccinated, I got COVID. And what a drain physically that was for me afterwards, and not recognizing that that also was affecting how I was operating. So I was actually having, and until very recently, have still been having some of that stress, some of those signs that might appear to look like burnout, because it affected me in those ways too. Now, the big question is, did it change my personality completely? In my case, I can honestly say, no, I don't think it did. I can recognize where my stress behaviors have been and where my usual style has been and what I've needed to do to get those needs met so that I can be spending more time in my usual style. So speaking of that, Mark, I want you to kind of respond to all of this just in general with any other comments you might have from an official Birkman perspective now. How do you respond to?
Well, personally, being a green, COVID did have adversely affect me because I work from home. I moved in the middle, so I was in a whole new environment where you couldn't get out and meet people, you couldn't meet with others, you couldn't meet with your teammates, you couldn't get together. It was definitely a struggle. So now on the other side of that, now working in an office, I enjoy the walking around, talking to people, getting the socialization. I feel like it was definitely a stressful time for me working in stress, but now I'm on the other side. And so I do feel like my needs are being met better in the current environment that I'm in. So I'm on the other end of that. So feeling like I needed to be back in the office. So I'm adjusting better now than I was in the previous. And that's another move in there as well. I think just in responding to just the amount of, I think stress really is something that we can all tolerate, but we all get to a point where we do react to it. We all get to a point where we do act out our behaviors according to stress. And each of us has probably a different tolerance of how much we can tolerate before we want to react to it. And I think, and for certain personalities, it really did affect them more than others. I think that's what Susan said. I agree with that. And I think Birkman would also agree with that as well, that there were people who were on the higher end of the map, the reds and the greens needed to be around people more. And so when you're isolating people, that tended to have more of a bigger effect on them as opposed to maybe more of the blues and the yellows. So that is from my perspective, Birkman's perspective, I think that's where we would take the stand, that we would see more of a reaction.
And you know, for a while, our church was closed to public services for 6 full months. It was 6 months before we came back. And we would hear a lot of people saying, yeah, the Zoom thing is nice, or it's okay. Pajama church is okay, watching online, but I can't wait until we get back together. You know, I can't wait till we get back together, and just chomping at the bit and realizing how much those people needed personal interaction and not just electronic interaction. They needed to feel a hug from people. They needed to be in the presence of real people. And some people, you know, that didn't have as great of a need for that, that might have been some of the people in charge might have been saying, yeah, but, you know, let's be safe. Let's stay on the side of caution. Let's not do the thing, you know, that we'd have to do with all the social distancing. And all of that, or people that are going to feel uncomfortable coming back. And it took a while before we could figure out, okay, I remember the first time that we came back to a service and someone made the statement, come on back, it's okay if you wear a mask. And that was, you know, kind of to me, a milestone in where things were going when they made that comment of not, it's okay if you don't wear a mask. It's okay if you do wear a mask, if you still feel uncomfortable coming into the large group. And how our culture has changed by this, it definitely was changed during COVID, how much it might have still been changed and affecting people. And then the other thing, Susan, that you mentioned, some of those people that lost their jobs, and some people that still have not recovered, have not gotten their jobs back, or they have had to take a lower paying job, have not been able to get back into their field yet for whatever reasons, and the ongoing stress that could still be causing them. All of that to say, when people are still in that stress mode, if there are still people that are still suffering some of that leftover burnout, some of that ongoing residual stress, or perhaps they are having still some signs of PTSD after the pandemic has officially been declared over, how should we deal with those people in terms of personality? Should those people be encouraged to take the questionnaire again?
It is our first response when somebody asks, and we know that we've come out of or are in stress, to walk them back through their current report and see if they can see themselves in their stress behaviors.
Yeah, in fact, we tried to give you some questions to ask in the article that we just sent out. Let me just walk through those quickly and see if you might have some others you would want to add to that. But as a coach, if I'm with someone who's saying, I think that maybe my personality really has changed and that this is not just a temporary thing, but I'm not the same person that I was before. One of the questions I would start with is, tell me about your current work environment, your environment in general. Are your needs or expectations basically being met, or, and don't just look at your usual style, look at your needs and your stress specifically. And when you see the descriptions of those in your report, what are you seeing? Are your needs and expectations still the same? Are they being met or not? Is there a possibility that what we're seeing here is really just stress behavior and that it might not be permanent? And then if you are coming to the conclusion that you're primarily operating in your stress behavior right now, is it because some of those needs are not being met? And what can you do to get those needs or expectations met? Just like we would always coach someone to say, what do you need to do to get your needs or expectations met? How do you get out of that stress behavior? And go through some of those steps as well. And then if they come and they say, no, I really think that my perspective has changed. My perspective is different now, and I don't think I've got the same needs, the same expectations that I had before. Well, in that case, let's talk about what would a retest be like. There is going to be expense involved. There's going to be time involved. You're going to need to go through the coaching of it again. And we would certainly say that once they have gone through it, hey, go back and look at the old report, look at the new report. Which one really and truly do you feel like is you? Now let's discard the one that you think is not you. Let's not let that muddy the waters, particularly as we're talking about with team interactions. We don't want to say, all right, which report should we use for you now, the first one or the second one? And we don't want them bouncing back and forth between them. So get them to kind of nail it down and then stick with that report that they feel is most relevant and current for them now. I have had people who've retested pre-COVID who came back and said, you know what, my first report really was the more accurate one after all. Okay, great. This is just another testimonial and let's do away with that. It was not too expensive, but an expensive experiment for you to come to that conclusion. Then the other thing I would say before we actually do the retest is look at interest. Don't just look at the needs stress, but remember that high interests, usually we say, in the range of 90 and above, that those can be real needs for the person, that I need to be doing things that are in that interest category for me to feel fulfilled. And look at the aversions. Have they been spending a lot of time down there in some of their interest scores that might be in the 10 or sub 10 category? Are they being called upon to do things that are absolutely not in their interest level, but are in their aversion categories? And if so, how's that causing them stress? And what kind of changes do you need to make to adapt to that? So go through the whole thing again, look at all of it in the same way, asking the same kinds of questions without regard to whether it is because of the pandemic or not, just looking at the reports for the report's sake. Now, that's how I would approach it. I don't know if any of you would have anything else to add to that. If you do, please kick in.
One thing I would add is the more familiar a person is with their Birkman scores and their reports, the less accurate a retest is going to be. Even though Birkman is a wonderful instrument in terms of validity and retest, retest reliability, it is still true that once I am really, really familiar with it, I can skew my results by the way I answer some of the questions. And so most of the people on this call, if not all, I would say should not ever retake your Birkman, because you would probably, at least one or two questions, you would identify what those were about and you could skew your results. Our more accurate assessment is always the first one when we're not familiar with it. And yeah, I recently had a lady that it didn't have anything to do with COVID, but with a life situation that she was in that I talked through this with. And I'm not sure she's come to any definitive conclusions yet. The list of things that Birkman mentions that can cause permanent personality change and warrant a retest, like death of a child, for example, those very, very traumatic situations that can cause some long-term personality change. Her situation was not on that list of things, but it was a more of a long-term 3 or 4 year, very traumatic situation in her family that caused her to question her own abilities, interests, even her gifts, spiritual gifts, and how they were used, because she did not take the GRIP-Birkman until after this situation occurred. And so she's questioning, what would it have been like before that situation occurred? Which of course we can technically never know. But I've given her some homework to go back and look at some of the things and see what she feels like really changed in her life and in the way she deals with situations at this point. So yeah, I think it would be very unusual for a person to need to retake their Birkman for a situation even as long-term and traumatic as COVID. But if the client insists, Mark, I'd like to hear your take on this. If the client insists and feels like that they really want to see what would happen, how do you approach that? How do you suggest we approach that? I've usually said, okay, if we've talked through it ad nauseum and have not, and you're still not convinced, then let's just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I mean, you can't stop them from retaking if they really want to retake it. No one can perfectly retake the test and the questionnaire in a way that they would answer every question the exact same way. So I've probably dealt with, in just the past few years, hundreds of people who have retaken it for a different reason, not because they want to do the personality, because they wanted some of the image management score. So I have looked at people who have taken it within about a 20-year difference. And you'll find that, yeah, some of their scores will shift. And Birkman would say that within about a 20-point difference, a shift would not really be a shift, because that's just a change in number. It's not really a change in behavior. So you can kind of look at it from about a 20-point shift. And you may find that some of the interests may reorder themselves, but you're probably not going to see a low interest become a high interest. So that's something just to keep in mind as you're coaching someone who has retested. And like Larry said, like really making sure that they do agree to one of them as being their Birkman scores and not jumping back and forth is something that's helpful, especially when you're dealing with the team, because that person, you don't want them disagreeing with their score because, oh, that was my old score. I agree with my new score. So really helping a person get ownership of their scores in their report as well. So you can see some difference in a test retake, but it's recommended that your first time you take the questionnaire is probably the most pure, and so it will probably be the more accurate according to statistics.
All right, the question I'm going to raise here, Mark, and Susan, and for all of you really, what about in the case if someone took the test during the pandemic when they were in this traumatic or very stressful environment? What about the accuracy of their questionnaire if they took it in the within the parameters of the or within the environment of the pandemic? Will their scores be as accurate then? Should they retest?
From what Dr. Birkman has told us in the past, their scores may be more accurate, maybe slightly more extreme, but maybe actually as accurate or more accurate than they would be when they're more relaxed and under less stress. We use Larry as the test case for that because he took it he completed the questionnaire on a night when there was a storm and the electricity and internet was about to go out, and it was the day he had to turn in his doctoral some part of his doctoral project, I think the final maybe or something. It was really, and we were in the middle of an international move. We were in the States at the time, but like the next day or two we were leaving, and I think we were going to Paul Ford's house for our first initiation into this, and then we were leaving immediately to go overseas. So you can't get too much more immediate stress than that. And so we asked Dr. Birkman about that when we were at Birkman doing our certification, our first certification training, and he just laughed and said, "Yeah, your scores may be a little extreme, but that's probably really who you are, and maybe a little bit more extreme than it would have come out on a different day, but yeah, that's who you are." And he's always on that and felt like it really was true. So I think, we can still help them on that. And even if I think what you said, Mark, when I'm looking at the scores, and if I'm looking at a comparison, I kind of look for patterns, and the pattern may go from here to here, or the distance in the difference between the usual behavior, might be a little slighter on one and a little greater on the other, but usually they're in the same quadrant. They're not moving extreme amounts, or if they're on the line of one quadrant to another, they might move barely over the line or something like that. But it's not usually on their Birkman map. It's not usually a huge difference in the pattern and the way it is expressed. So I think we can concentrate on that pattern more than just on the individual scores.
If you're looking at the map and maybe there's one of their symbols has changed quadrants, but look and see, was it close to the line anyway? And did it just, move across the line somewhat? And, just one or two questions on the questionnaire could make that difference. Sometimes a negative question that's showing an aversion could push it in the opposite direction or in another direction, as well as something that you're saying, yeah, that is what I'm looking for. So be aware of those patterns. Even with just the map, we talk about direction and distance of movement. Is the direction of the movement still the same? That could be very important. Maybe the distance has changed somewhat. Maybe it's gotten greater or lesser, but that is not as important as the direction of the movement when you're looking at that.
And the likelihood of where the change could happen in a retake is going to probably happen in the map, just because the way the map is constructed and the amount of data that's pulled for the map. It doesn't take as much to change the map data. Just a couple questions can change where you appear on the map. So really, you might see the greatest distance change within the map when someone retakes.
And especially look at those that are close to another quadrant, because you get some descriptors from both sides. And so, sometimes just looking at the letters on by our name won't tell the whole picture because we're not able to see that mask of the intensity of the school. Well, I want to shift to the GRIP for a few minutes here to talk about, because we look at the GRIP a little bit differently. John, the article that you wrote on this points that out, that the GRIP might be more dynamic than the Birkman. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think stress behavior is going to impact. Obviously, we've talked about how it's going to impact our usual behavior, but because it's the dotted diamond, it does imply that it's coming out of a place of our needs having been met. Therefore, we're starting from a place of our usual behavior. And I think that fundamentally, we just have to remember that it's not a diamond, a dotted square. It's not a dotted circle. It's not a dotted asterisk. It's a dotted diamond. And because of that, then it means that we're coming from a place where we can accurately then understand I'm doing well, my needs are met, therefore the Holy Spirit, and really I think the shift, and I think this is probably the most important thing, the shift that happens from us internally when our needs are met is that my eyes are focused outward. When my needs are not being met, or when I'm trying to meet my own needs, either just by way of I'm trying to meet my needs or stress behavior, I'm trying to meet them in an unhealthy way, that's an internal focus. That's a focus on me. My diamond allows there to be an external focus. So that then shifts my whole posture to paying attention in a different way to those around me. And when I'm in that place naturally, then the Holy Spirit just has simply greater access to be able to do that. And so from the nature of our needs being met, then it's just different as far as how we will see the power of the Holy Spirit show up consistently. Now, again, I'm not going to box in the Holy Spirit and say that he can't use us in times of stress and times of our fatigue. He certainly can. But when we talk about stewardship, we're talking about consistently being able to identify and utilize those spiritual gifts. Those are going to come from a place of our needs having been met and us coming from a place of relative health, so that our attention and focus can be on those opportunities and the people around us in a way that when we're under stress behavior, they're simply not.
Ken, I know sometimes you have been a proponent that someone really does need to take their GRIP again. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of those cases?
I guess my argument has been all along that if our gifts are used to build the body, God sometimes puts us in different contexts where we need different gifts to build the body in this context. And so maybe in a different context, that the gift that I'd normally have is already met there. Therefore, God needs me to be powerful, gifted in another way. But taking GRIP again is helpful at times. It is, my experience is that I've encouraged people to take it again and say very specifically, what team are you thinking about? What particular group is it that when you're taking this, you're thinking about? Because it's the GRIP part of this is almost always in relationship. I do this or whatever. Well, in my own experience, there's a very different gift mix. Depends whether I'm working with, when I was in a district office with that leadership team, or when I was working with another group, another small group that I work with. So yeah, I do think that there's some option for change there, much more so than in the Birkman. And it also means that our dotted diamond then can actually look differently, because while our personality may not change much, if God is using different gifts at different times, it's going to change the way people perceive us.
So where the dotted diamond might be moving could definitely shift in that case, right?
Yeah, I think and from my perspective, that would be the most obvious, that the dotted diamond has actually made a shift. So this is how I saw this person on my team. Now the two of us are on a different team, and suddenly, if I'm looking at their dotted diamond, for some reason it looks very differently, because in this context, they really need to take over leadership, or they really need to let go leadership, or they really need to be the person who's calling us to a new level of expertise and teamwork. So yeah, you're going to have some changes there in that context. And I'm much more comfortable with the GRIP changes than I am with the Birkman changes. And my experience with Birkman is that I worked with a team that was falling apart, literally. I mean, they had fired a staff, and there were some legal issues that were going to come out of that. They knew that, all sorts of things. And so they want me to do a team build. Well, that was a tough team build. Well, about 3 years later, the pastor comes back and says, boy, so much is different. Things are good now. I'm happy. I need to write this again. So we wrote a whole GRIP-Birkman. What was interesting is that the GRIP actually had some shifts in. The Birkman you could almost take the two maps and hold them up one behind each other. So very little change in personality, high degree in change in how they saw themselves being gifted to serve the body of Christ.
Yeah. Les, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've observed, and I've not been around as long as you guys have, is that there's a huge difference between I feel different versus I'm doing new things. I feel different. They think their personality has changed, and it's probably more stress or reaction to changes around them. Whereas I'm doing new things probably actually could be a significant change. Even for pastors, a couple of my pastor friends who were pastors in a church setting became more chaplains during COVID. And they were using gifts they had never used before. And they retook, and it was reflected in their scores. But doing new things was radically different than I feel different. The Birkman didn't change. So that was my observation during COVID with that.
I think that's a really important point, Les, that when we have new experiences in ministry, what do we know are the flaws of any gifts inventory, period? Well, we know one of the flaws of any gifts inventory is that it measures experience, right? And because it measures experience, then as I have new experiences, my gifts are changing. And I would just caution us again, and I'm not going to change I would caution us to say how gifts are received on the other end has less about what I'm doing, has more about how the Holy Spirit shows up. And so I would just say, COVID, pastors going from primarily being seen as upfront exhorters or prophets to now all of a sudden having to utilize that gift of pastoring. Maybe it's the gift of pastoring. Maybe it's just that they were forced into more one-on-one alongside context for a while. How did people experience that? Well, when you were here, man, I felt like I could make it another day. Okay, maybe gift of pastoring, maybe it's just the gift of exhortation showing up in a one-on-one relationship rather than coming from a preacher, speaking out in front. So I would just say how the gift is used is going to be very dramatically different. And COVID pushed us out in that in so many ways. How people experience that gift or how that gift shows up in different contexts. I'm in front of a large group. I'm one-on-one. I'm in a small group setting. There will be some consistent patterns through that. And I'm with Ken in that they may reorder in seasons, but for us to see something that would have been below outside of the top 6, all of a sudden be a 1, 2, or 3. I haven't seen it often. And so I would say, let's really dig into joy and power and fruit and get back to where are they consistently seeing that, because the number of people walking away from ministry wasn't because they were getting to use new gifts, right? It was because they were being forced outside of their areas of gifting that they couldn't function and consistently, and they didn't know how to get back to ways of using those spiritual gifts. And so I would really encourage us to say, hey, rather than retaking and having that, or if we do retake that, make sure that the coaching is driving back to those times in ministry of greatest joy and power and fruit, and what was going on and why did that happen and how were others experiencing it, and how do we get back to some of that? How do we get to places where you're in that? And frankly, if they can't imagine it, and I think I use this illustration, I was just talking with someone recently, and they couldn't remember what it was like to really use those gifts, or they couldn't actually even picture what it would be like in the future to use that. Well, that just tells me I'm having the wrong conversation right now. I need to go over to the Birkman conversation and talk about, we got to address some of these needs, and what's one little sliver, what's one little thing that you could do within that gifting to experience some of that joy that would bring you some, that would allow God's power to show up powerfully, to redirect the conversation back into that. So, I would say from what I'm seeing, that's a lot of my take from what I'm experiencing as far as people in ministry right now.
Yeah,
And
and
John,
I would add
to that. No, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I would add to it, like just the normal, what we used to call as normal has changed. And so just really understanding, like, now we're in the new normal. It may never go back to the normal. So how do we readjust the things, and how do we help ourselves really go, okay, now what used to happen, what I used to be successful at, or even what do I needed from that environment that I could get now is different. So really going back to some of that is looking at the new normal and reevaluating, like, how do I operate, because what is needed is different than what used to be needed, and what my gifts, what my gifting could be is going to be maybe different because of what is needed now.
The order of them might change. And that's why I would say we really need to look at team styles and bodybuilding roles. Don't just look at the list of gifts and are those gifts being employed, but how are they being employed? And coming to what you were saying, Liz, I think that's where we can, or Ken, that's where we can probably see where the need of the body is and how I'm using my gifts. The order of them at the top might change, but I agree with you totally, John. Those top gifts are not going to drop to the bottom, and the bottom gifts are not going to come into the top six. I just don't see that happen. I have not seen that happen, except I suppose in someone who took the grip really, really soon after they became a believer. And then later on, as they matured and they began to discover how God was using them, and they were not just taking the questionnaire from a secular standpoint, but now they're really taking it from an informed spiritual standpoint with some experience. Now, yeah, that may have changed. But looking at their teams
or age, if they were
too,
really
sure.
young when they took it, and they just didn't have a lot of ministry experience. Because I've had people take the grip all the way down as 8th graders, right? And then as they have more life experience and as they understand the Holy Spirit.
Sure. Yeah, to even just understand it from that standpoint. But those team styles and those bodybuilding roles, the order in them sometimes does change, and how you can use those and how the Spirit wants to use us for the building up of the body. So I would look really carefully at how those might be shifting around in that conversation. There, I think I have seen a lot more change. Susan, what?
Yeah, I was going to just emphasize what you said about the spiritual maturity. In our church, we've had a lot of people that have come into the class that we do with the GRIP, and our minister of education is moving people in there when they're very new Christians. They've just come into the church. And it's not totally without value for them to do the GRIP at that point, because they don't even know what a spiritual gift is. And so they're learning the concepts and how that works. But when they've taken the inventory, what I see coming out sometimes is their gift inventory is more reflective of their personality. For example, they'll come out with the gift of administration if they have a strong yellow in the Birkman, which may or may not be really their spiritual gift, but that's all they know is their personality at that point. They haven't really experienced using their spiritual gifts. And so we have to be able to kind of reframe, what are they looking at and how are they looking at it, and what is a spiritual gift as opposed to their personality, so that they can really grow in their knowledge of that. And And then maybe it is appropriate for them to take the GRIP when they've had more experience and more maturity, more spiritual maturity.
That to me says we don't need to have just one conversation with someone and think it's a one and done. That we really do need to have follow-up visits. We need to continually be talking about this, constantly be looking at our inventories and seeing how God is using us and what he is creating us to be. And he is still in the process of creating me and forming me. I haven't reached full maturity yet. Let me just ask Nathan, I haven't called on you, but if you're still there and you could open your mic, do you have anything else you want to add or question or comment to all of this?
We had a baby during the pandemic, and it was a very interesting time between before and after. And I thought that was interesting how someone said there was a new normal after the pandemic. I kind of saw that. I saw that firsthand because we never saw the transition between the pandemic. We just saw my wife had a baby, and so we had a pandemic baby, and so we could see there was a huge delta after and before. So a little bit about context. My wife is a community health counselor, so she does counseling in the community, and so that was her role before and after. So she was a chaplain in the community for in-home health care. So that's how I saw that it was different. She kind of plays the role of a pastor chaplain in the community. So just a bit more context for you guys. Yeah, I saw the delta definitely for that.
Yeah, wow. Thank her for her service.
Right.
And doing that in the midst of having a baby too.
Yeah.
Wow. You bring up an interesting point there too, Nathan, that we always like to talk about normal, but it's normal from my perspective, normal from your perspective. What is your perspective of what normal is supposed to be, right? And for many of us, that may have changed now, where we realize, I need to deal with the reality of today and not just be wishing for yesterday or tomorrow, but live the reality of today. So whatever today is normal, and let's just deal with it, right?
Yeah, you had two huge changes in your life.
Yeah.
Pandemic going on, and then the new baby in your household that changes the family dynamics. And so, that's a lot of change to assimilate in a family. And I'm praying for you that God will continue to help you weather those changes and come out on this other side of the pandemic as a healthy, happy, growing family.
Role changed, work changed, people changed, and so very, very neat to see that. Thank you for that food for thought. I'm going to reflect on that more.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Nathan. That personal perspective helps a lot. It's been great talking with you all. We hope to see you again next month. Meanwhile, I hope this will help you to do more to help individuals and teams build unity in the body of Christ so more people will know Jesus. Hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.